Welcome back, everyone, to Issues of Faith. Glad you were with us. We've been talking about unprecedented times and the unprecedented times that we are in, certainly for churches, for all of us. Churches have closed worship, but it has happened before with the 1918 Spanish flu here in Nashville and other pandemics prior to that. And we are happy to have with us Dr. John Mark Hicks. He's the professor of theology at the Hayslip School of Theology at Lipscomb University, joining us via Zoom. And as we went to break, I said, through the lens of history, churches were reluctant. There were some churches reluctant to close back in 1918. I know there were some churches reluctant to stop having public worship today. I think some were worried people would just drift away from the church. What happened after everything calmed down? What happened to churches? Did some have to close? Were they negatively impacted? Sort of what was the fallout after the Spanish flu?
Well, I can tell you about the Russell Street Church of Christ, for example. It exploded because it served its community. It grew by leaps and bounds. And new churches were planted. All in a downtown area, the Central Church of Christ was planted in the 1920s, and it conducted a medical health clinic, and it had dormitories for the homeless and for nursing students. In other words, this episode gives the church new lens. It gives it new eyes. And I think when we think of, when we have anxiety about the church, which the American church has had a lot of anxiety about itself and decreasing numbers, and if we carry that anxiety over post-epidemic, then yeah, we're going to keep sliding down. But if we use the pandemic, if we see the pandemic, as horrible as it is, as a moment in which we can love our neighbors and serve others, that's what people are going to remember. You see, this has happened over and over again in church history. Go back to 250s, when the Roman Empire was persecuting Christians. And the Roman Empire went through a whole wave, a series of waves of epidemics in that decade, in the 250s. So on the one hand, they're persecuting the Christians, and on the other hand, they have these epidemics, for which they're blaming the Christians in large part. But Christians respond to that by caring for the sick, not just among themselves, but by going out into the streets and caring and bringing those into their homes and into their church buildings. Well, church buildings as much as that existed at that time. And the Roman Empire took notice. You know, there was about 40 years of no persecution after those moments, after that epidemic ended, because the empire saw the faith of Christians. And this is what we need. We don't need Christians out there bashing around, complaining and arguing and beating each other up and beating up the government and beating up different politicians. What we need is a focus on loving our neighbors and serving. And if we can do that through this pandemic, we will come out on the other side blessed, I believe. I don't know whether that turns the church around in any way. I am not a prophet in that way. But I do know that history has demonstrated over and over again that when, in the moments of crisis, when Christians step up and serve others at risk to their lives, just like our nurses and doctors and healthcare workers are doing right now, and if Christians will do that and do it with energy and do it with a sense of vocation and love, that has changed the course of history many, many times.
Well, that's a great opportunity then for the church.
Absolutely.
So there's so many people, these are such challenging times, there's so much anxiety, but it is kind of encouraging to hear that there may be opportunity and that we can come out of this okay and better.
And we have to seize the moment, though. We can't just sit back and say, we're just going to wait till things get back to normal. Maybe normal's not what we want. Maybe we want a new normal where the love of neighbor and ministry and service to the poor are more dominant than our worship services have tended to dominate. And let me give you another Nashville example here. 1873. A group of prisoners came from West Tennessee into Nashville, and they were put into the state penitentiary here. and they carried with them cholera. And they infected some in the prison, and some of the prisoners started to die. And then it got outside the prison walls, and the city started to be infected. And within the space of 6 weeks, one out of every 25 Nashvillians died.
Now, what year was that?
25.
Whoa, that's crazy.
1873.
Wow. Okay.
Now, here's what happened, though. All the ministers in town except one stayed in town to minister to the sick. And that made a deep impression on the city of Nashville. And one of them was David Lipscomb, the namesake of my employer, right, the Lipscomb University. David Lipscomb, who lived 10 miles outside of town, came into town and stayed in his office and got in his buggy and took nuns to the sick and to those who were hurting and the poor. And he himself went into the homes of African Americans and bathed them and nursed them and fed them and distributed food, and actually got sick himself. He recovered, but nevertheless he exposed himself to that, and just like other ministers in town did as well. And that is a really important point. And what David Lipscomb did is he wrote an article in the Gospel Advocate in 1873 critiquing Christians who fled town. He critiqued the wealthy. It's only the wealthy who could get out of town. The African Americans, who were poor and segregated, they couldn't get out of town. And more African Americans died than whites in that cholera epidemic. And there were fewer African Americans in town. So what happened was the poor couldn't afford food, they couldn't afford the medicine, they couldn't afford the care, and they died. And Lipscomb chided Christians who left town and said, you need to be Jesus in this moment. And Jesus serves the other. And when we serve the other, when we serve the sick and the prisoner, etc., we serve Jesus himself, because Jesus is found in the poor, not found in your summer house outside of town or found in the relatives down in the next town. We need to stay and serve. And that happened in 1873, and it had a positive impact on the churches.
That's great. And so we have these examples, that example then from the Spanish flu, where churches open their doors and become hospitals, where they rise to the occasion. Now, exactly. I'll ask you, and so I don't know that historians are comfortable talking about these things, but is the church of today ready to rise to this challenge, in your opinion?
Well, that's a good question. I think that remains to be seen. My experience is that, yes, what I see happening in churches that I know of and that I'm aware of, I see people connecting in ways they never connected before. I see them getting out in their community in ways they haven't gotten out in their communities before. And I think that what we see in churches is a new pivot. That is, maybe there's going to be a new orientation to a different sort of ministry and a different sort of emphasis in our ministry. That, yes, we'll hold on to our services. They're really important. That's important to do. But at the same time, we need to respond to those who are hurting in our communities. And this epidemic is giving us an opportunity to respond. And we'll see how the churches respond. I hope they just respond well. I know some of them are, but I also know that some Christians are just filled with worry and anxiety, and they're consumed about their own interest and their own politics and their own agendas. And if that's how we come out of this, and people in our nation look back and say, those Christians, they were only concerned about politics. They were only concerned about their economics. And if that's what people see, then the church is going to be hurting even more than it was before this happened. But if they see that Christians are stepping out, engaged, moving into the community, and loving their neighbors, which is what our faith calls us to, right? It's what the gospel calls us to become Jesus for other people, to be the one through whom Jesus loves other people. If we can do that, then we might also be in a place where, as has happened in other times in history, the culture appreciates Christians rather than attacking Christians.
I love it.
Isn't this a moment when the church can say,
this is an important moment for the church, an opportunity for the church.
right,
A lot of anxiety, but it's an important moment. I've got to, we've run out of time. I've got to let you go.
Oh, okay. No problem.
Thank you so much. Great stuff. I'm so glad I read this article. If you want to read it, you can find it, How Churches of Christ Responded When the 1918 Spanish Flu Killed Millions. Dr. John Mark Hicks, professor of theology there at Lipscomb. Thank you for being with us. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, too.